In this lecture set, we're going to be discussing statistical storytelling. Now, this isn't a formal topic that you're going to see in any textbook, but for me, in thinking through what we're doing in this class and what we're hoping to accomplish, I really wanted to talk about not just the technical aspects of doing statistics, not just the interpretational aspects of doing statistics, but really where everything comes together. And to me, the best context in which to do this is to talk about how we make an argument with statistics, how we tell a story with statistics. And so this lecture set is going to try to help to teach you some of the ways in which we can put those stories together. Now, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about some of our goals with statistical storytelling. We're going to talk about the different places of some of the different tools that we have in statistical storytelling. And then I'm really hoping also that you get the hang of the gut feel of where we're trying to go with this, and that I really can convince you that statistics are a piece of evidence. But ultimately, just like with hypothesis testing, as we talked about before, the goal is to convince you. Our goal is to provide evidence, just like in a court case, just like when making any other decision. We have evidence that we make decisions based on, and all of the tools that we have and will talk about are just tools to collect evidence, and that understanding that evidence at a deep level, in the same way as understanding any other evidence, understanding evidence in court if you're a jury, that understanding just helps you to make a better decision. The goal of all of this is to help you understand the world better and help you make better decisions. And again, it's my hope that through this lecture set, we're going to get there and help to convince you as to not just that it's true, but how that comes to be true. All right, so we're going to start with a slow entry. And what I mean by that is we're not going to jump right into all the different pieces and what they all do and what they contribute as part of the story and how that comes together. I want to start with the tone of statistical stories. And we're going to lean heavily on a recent publication from the president of the American Statistical Association, former president of the American Statistical Association, in talking about how we approach putting statistical stories together. So let's get into this, but that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture video. So as I mentioned just a second ago, the goal is to present convincing evidence. So just like with hypothesis testing, that was what we were doing. Here, that's what we're doing too. When we tell a statistical story, our goal is to present evidence regarding whatever decision we're making and to be able to explain that rationale. Now, all of this is based in logic and reason. All of this is based in trying to convince someone of something. And oftentimes it's yourself. You're trying to convince yourself of what happened or convince yourself why you should move into one direction or another. And we do this with all decisions. With any decision, you have a reason that you're doing it. Here, we're trying to, again, have evidence to support the reason or rationale. I'm going to accept a new program because I think it's going to work better. Well, why do you think it's going to work better? And here we're discussing the rationale and reasoning behind that and trying to discuss how to present this in a convincing way. So we're going to talk about different tools that we have. And I will say at the front end, mixing multiple tools together often presents the most compelling of stories. And you may be doing this without even thinking about it, but it is a good thing to intentionally focus on. And it's not always true. It's a good rule of thumb, but there's some cases where there's a very, very, very specific question in a very specific context that is being asked. And so to present your story or present the evidence, there is a very specific type of evidence that needs to be presented. And in that case, then mixing multiple tools can be distracting from that single piece of evidence that's necessary. With this said, in most cases, at least in my professional experience, virtually in all cases actually, mixing multiple tools together presents the most compelling story. And the interesting part is because each tool provides a different type of evidence, once you can isolate what types of evidence each of our tools that we're going to talk about in this lecture set are providing, you can intentionally lean one way or the other, or use different types of evidence to supplement each other. So I'm going to select, hey, I've got, these 5 different types of evidence or 3 different types of evidence. I'll select one particular type selection from this type, one particular selection from this type, and I'm going to use ones that merge well together. Or maybe, hey, I know I'm speaking to this audience. I really want to make it more accessible, so I'm going to lean more heavily on this type and then supplement with some of the more detailed types of evidence. So mixing these together and providing a different mixture depending on your audience and depending on the research question is a great way to create a most compelling story, because it's not just about if you're quote unquote right or not. And we'll get to that question in a second, or a bit of the fallacy of that question in a second. But it's also about, can you describe it? I think I mentioned this in one previous video, and I like to say this with regards to statistics. It doesn't really matter where we go wrong if we end up making the wrong decision. So whether it is a poorly designed research question, whether it's poorly designed variables, whether it's poor data collection, whether it's poor analysis, whether it's poor decisions, whether it's poor implementation, or whether it's just the implementation and interpretation wasn't explained well, so we misunderstood and then made a poor decision anyway, it doesn't really matter where those things go wrong in terms of the outcome of the decision. We still made the wrong decision. The goal here is to help you understand what are the components of evidence that we can bring to articulate the nature of the evidence that we have as well as possible. And as well as possible doesn't necessarily mean it's in the direction you wanted it to go. The results of the research might point in a different direction than you were expecting. They might point against what you had initially wanted. And the goal of this process is to articulate what those results say, not necessarily what you wanted them to say, with the end reason being helping our constituents, helping our administrators, helping ourselves or our board or our staff to understand what's going on so that we all can make the best decision possible. That's the purpose behind telling a good story. Now, I'm not sure if y'all have been in these types of meetings. It's actually one of my pet peeves, where somebody starts talking about something and then their evidence for what they're saying is completely flawed or can be interpreted in absolutely the wrong direction. Now, sometimes this is just that the person who's speaking in this hypothetical context, and I'm thinking of a very real context right now that happened kind of recently, but sometimes it's just that the person speaking either isn't aware of this, or it's that the person speaking is just really biased and really wants to sell their opinion even though they're not being very supported. But oftentimes what happens is that the person has support if they would just look in a different place. They had the support there. They're just highlighting or articulating the wrong piece of support that doesn't actually support what they're saying. In the words that we'll talk about in this lecture set, they're leaning on the wrong tool or type of evidence to provide the foundation or the strength of their argument. They're trying to convince people using the wrong type of evidence for the wrong type of claim. And ultimately, what this means is you leave holes in your story. If I lean on the wrong type of evidence to make some type of convincing claim, then a detractor in the board or in my C-suite office, or even a staff person, if you've developed the type of culture where staff can speak up, and I hope you have, that's very good for decision making, but a staff person may raise their hand and say, hey, look, what you're saying doesn't seem to connect to your type of evidence. And that drastically weakens your argument. Again, you may have strong support for the claims that you're making or the story that you're telling. But if you use the wrong kinds of support, even if it was there in the first place, then the story that you tell is a pretty weak story. The argument that you make is a pretty weak argument. And it's because the story you're telling and or the argument you're making is actually incorrect. Those detractors have a really good point that you didn't articulate or you didn't address. And so it's important to learn the right tools so that you can incorporate the right tool and the right type of evidence for the support of the particular story that you're telling or argument that you're making at that time. So, stories have multiple components, and what we're going to try to help you think through is which piece of evidence supports which component of the argument. All right. Again, goal of this section, figuring out the types of evidence and when and how to use them. Now, when we're talking about this, I want to be really, really careful here. A lot of times when individuals approach this topic, they approach the topic, and I should say non-statistically minded individuals. Frankly, even statistically minded individuals, we aren't flawless either. We just know the flaws a little better than many. When they approach this topic, they approach it from the concept or from the perspective of trying to find evidence that supports what they believe. And this is not the goal of statistical storytelling. So what I'm trying to teach you in this lecture set is not how to find evidence for what you believe. One of the most famous contracts, at least in my world, that I turned down was a billion dollar project. And I'm not even going to describe the nature of the project because it's still ongoing. But in a call with the project representative who was doing recruiting for the statisticians, and we had a nice long series of calls, but in our last one, we started talking about the scope of the project. And they said, look, we want you to find evidence that this perspective is true. And after a series of conversations regarding that, I ended up saying, look, I can't ethically do that. That is not the background of statistical storytelling. Now, I want to be careful here because there is a bit, at least, of a personal ethical thing, and that's something that others may or may not agree with. This is also true from an analytics mathematical perspective, that when you try to find evidence for something, that mathematically you will. It's a weird thing to think about, but recall our p-value and our type 1 error rate. We set our type 1 error rate typically at 95% confident, 0.05 error rate or 5% error rate. That fractionally is about 1 out of 20. That means about 1 out of 20 times you'll do something by chance. Now, if I'm looking for evidence for my point, and I just look at, 100 variables, 1 out of 20 is 5 out of 100. That's 5%, 5 out of 100, 5% error rate. If I just look at 100 variables that are completely random, have nothing at all to do with what I'm talking about, on average, I might expect 5 of them to show my point, just by error, mathematically. Again, these are mathematically randomly generated variables, have nothing at all to do with my point. I might expect 5 out of 100 of them to show my point with 95% confidence, only 5% error rate. And if I just delete the other 95 that I didn't like and just highlight the 5 that did, quote unquote, prove my point, what I will have is a bunch of bad evidence. Now, it's not bad from an ethical standpoint. And again, I do think there's an ethical consideration here. It's bad from a decision-making standpoint in that again, these values were randomly generated and are at the population level completely unrelated to my question. We had a 5% error rate, and again, on average, 5 out of those 100 variables showed something that I wanted them to show as it related to my question. The problem is, again, at the population core level where those variables were generated, they are unrelated to my question. So if I use these in the future, these are going to be unrelated to the outcome. Or worse, they're related in the opposite direction to the outcome, but through error happen to have a quote unquote statistically significant relationship. So I encourage reflection on this, because the starting point of the story can't be to prove your point. And again, this isn't just an ethical thing. For me personally, it is. But this is a mathematical thing. If you start with this goal, you will find what you're looking for, and your decisions will be mathematically bad because of it. And again, consider the risk as to what happened when I looked at 100 variables looking for something that had my story. I found 5 of them did. Then I made decisions on that. And then the next data collection, it turns out all 5 are actually unrelated. And it's because there was just error with that data collection. That's what our whole 5% error rate thing is about. There's always a chance to be wrong. And if I really just hunt for things to agree with me rather than hunt for the true description of the story, which 95 out of those 100 variables had, right? 95 variables had no relationship. 5 of them had a relationship in the direction I wanted. If I was looking to understand the data, 95 out of 100 tell me I shouldn't do this. 5 out of 100 agree with what I want. So I'm going to do it. And then I go collect data again. And those 5, because they're from the same population as everything else, when I collect data again, they are all now unrelated. And there's no reason for surprise there. That's absolutely mathematically expected. So I'm getting a bit off on my high horse and lecture box at the beginning of this lecture set. I apologize. But this is an important consideration. And it's easy to make the argument ethically, I think. I think we all can understand the flaws with approaching a situation where we're just trying to prove our point and we're not trying to understand what's going on. And that's how we'll talk about this in the future, because I do think that is an easier mindset to address and a less technical mindset to address. But I point this out too because this isn't just a problem ethically. This is truly a problem mathematically with the way that we've designed our decisions. And if you ignore that, then your decisions are going to end up being wrong decisions. Or if they're right, it's not because of the data support. The data-made decisions are going to be wrong decisions. And so it's important when you're doing a statistical story, and for all of the techniques I'm going to teach you today, they presuppose that you are telling this type of statistical story, that you tell the story from the goal of the learner mindset. That is, you're trying to ask questions of the data without presuming what they're going to say, and then you learn what they have to say. And that is what you're presenting. I'm not sure if this program works or not. We have the null hypothesis. Ultimately, you're approaching it. I have this new drug protocol. I want to see if it's effective. Or I have a new outpatient support system. I want to see if that works. Or I have a new employee management system. I want to see if that's effective. Or some new billing code that I want to determine how well that physicians adopt this. All of these things, if I go into it assuming, or not just even assuming that it works, but trying to hunt for information that it's effective, again, you're going to probably find something. But if I go into it saying, all right, I don't know if this works or not, let's see if it does, and then you collect data and then you assess that data to determine if it works or not, that's the process that we're talking about with statistical storytelling. And that's where our statistical techniques, again, can be useful and have the error rates you think they do. They have those 5% error rates. Again, if you go hunt for data that agrees with you, what you've really done is you've messed up your error rate. You've ignored the 95 out of 100 that disagree with you. You found the 5 that agree with you. And now your error rate, instead of being 5%, is 100%. You've just found all of the errors. And how do we avoid this? Well, we avoid this by not hunting for data. Sometimes it's called cherry picking. There's a famous quote on this that I kind of like. It says, don't use statistics like a drunken man uses a lamp post for support rather than illumination. And the point here is that, again, you should seek to learn from the data. They should illuminate what's going on. They should help you understand and see what's going on and what you should do. They should help guide your decision-making through bringing light to the surrounding area, bringing light to a topic that you didn't know anything about before in terms of a quantitative approach. And this is how you should use data, rather than trying to prop up your position. Another funny quote on this is, if you torture your data enough, they'll confess to anything, and kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier. That it's not that you won't find it, and it's not even that it's ethically wrong, and though I again think that it is ethically wrong, unless you explain what you did. That's a big picture in statistical storytelling that I have, is anything's okay if you explain what you did. Of course, if you explain to your board of directors, hey, I ignored 95% of the results and I just picked the 5% that agreed with me, and you're open and honest and explain clearly, you may not get the funding you want for your new program. So if you're open and honest about it, I think you can kind of do whatever you want. But here, it's just very important to start from the perspective of following along with what your data is saying, genuinely asking the question. I call it a learner mindset. Try to learn from your data rather than telling your data what to do. All right. So let's jump into ATOM, A-T-O-M. ATOM is an acronym, and again was put out in a paper by Ron Weserstein, who is the former president of the American Statistical Association, and is a method by which we should report data. The acronym stands for A, accept uncertainty, B, be thoughtful, O, be open, and M, be modest. And we're going to go into each of these in more detail. But accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, be open, and be modest when telling your statistical story. So first one, accept uncertainty. We've talked about this previously, but in applied statistics, we never prove anything. We offer evidence for and against, and sometimes we offer really strong evidence, but nothing is ever proven. And again, this comes from the fact that we're using a sample to represent a population. We're using few to make a decision regarding the characteristics of many, most of which we have never studied or looked at or met or even known. And there's always error possible in that. So in applied statistics, we never prove. And it's important to realize this, because with things like p less than 0.05 or test statistic greater than the critical value, and terms like statistical significance. Remember, statistical significance was when we reject the null hypothesis. We call that a statistically significant finding. It's easy to forget that this is still a question. So again, in the previous lecture set, we talked about like p less than alpha, reject the null hypothesis, or test statistic greater than / less than critical value, greater than the big critical value, less than the small critical value. In the shaded region, we reject the null hypothesis. And those things are ways in which we make a decision based on the quantification of the amount of risk, right? We said 5% error rate, a 0.05 error rate. And with these, that's true. That's the decision we make given that error rate. On the other hand, though that seems like a fixed and firm thing, don't forget there's still an error rate that is not a 100% proof that the question is still open. We don't have the culminating evidence to end all evidences. And with this, what we haven't talked about before is you have to accept a bit of lack of certainty into your mind. You have to accept a bit of I'm struggling to find the right word. A bit of cognitive dissonance may be the right word, where I'm going to make a decision, but I'm going to realize I'm not 100% sure that it's right. And because of this, if new evidence comes out that it's wrong, you shouldn't dismiss new evidence because of the previous evidence. You should take both of them together and, again, try to understand them. We'll actually talk a little bit later in this lecture about what do we do when we get unexpected results, and that could be new evidence that disagrees with old evidence. Long story short, we just need to understand what's going on and what the distinction is. But it's important in this case because when the ASA talks about accepting uncertainty, this is what they mean. That even with a statistically significant finding, even with a low p-value, even with a test statistic that's way outside of the critical values, that is very incompatible with that null hypothesis, and strong rejection of the null hypothesis, even in that case, we need to accept this level of uncertainty and probability and chance. Even in those cases, there's still a chance that we could be wrong. And so we're making the best decision we can with the evidence that we can, but there's still that chance we can be wrong. And this is a balance. This is why I use the term cognitive dissonance. And I think it's a pretty good one. I don't know. I'm a math person. I'm not a words person. But I use cognitive dissonance because it's a balance. You shouldn't be too unconfident in a statistically significant finding, but neither should you be too confident. So all of this is to say, it's still a somewhat open question. There are no closed questions in applied statistics, and there aren't. There's always opportunity for new evidence. There are no closed questions in applied statistics. We're not math. We don't have proofs. We have evidence for and evidence against, and sometimes we have strong evidence. And so all this is to say, even with strong evidence, it's still an open question. But you can be confident of things with strong evidence. Confidence is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem that they're addressing in this particular paper, and I can say is true in my experience professionally, is that the balance tends to swing in overconfidence. Typically, when we're dealing with people, unless they're graduate students, I should say new graduate students without professional experience. Typically, what we're dealing with is overconfidence in decisions, not underconfidence. And that's why this is a big piece in their recommendations, is don't be overconfident. And I'll phrase that here just by summarizing and saying there are no closed book questions in applied statistics. Even with our evidence, even with strong evidence, the question isn't closed. And if there's new evidence against, then we need to take the time and understand that new evidence, recall and re-understand our previous evidence, and determine what's going on and what's causing these pieces of evidence to disagree. But we don't reject new evidence. It's again, there's never a closed book question. There's never a closed book question. All right. Be thoughtful. So this is a quote from the article that's published. I love that it starts with, "We're not accusing anyone of being lazy." I just thought that was pretty funny. I also like the end of this, that one of the ways that we can be thoughtful is to really clearly express our objectives ahead of time. And this actually goes to what I was discussing before with those 100 variables that we looked at, and then we picked our favorite 5. If we don't really clearly express what we're going to do ahead of time, we open ourselves up for risk of doing that. And it's really easy to do. It's really tempting to do. And we open ourselves up for that risk. So being really clearly ahead of time, it's called a priori ahead of time. Making determinations after we've already done the study is called post hoc. So you'll hear me say those again later. A priori before the fact, post hoc after the fact. So it's really important to clearly express what you're going to do a priori ahead of time, and what levels of evidence you're going to need to make one decision, what level of evidence you'll need to make a different decision, and be really clear and firm on those methods. Be really sure that you're putting together a study that's actually going to convince you one way or the other. We can talk about that later too, or we'll talk about that later too. But as they say in this article, the most reliable evidence comes from exactly what this is, which is a pre-planned study with clearly expressed objectives that you're starting with. Now, the other thing to think about is that sometimes there are risks of findings. Sometimes there are costs that aren't necessarily involved, and statistics often don't incorporate those costs. I think we talk about that later in this lecture set too. So it's important to realize this ahead of time and to really think through what that ends up being. I think I mentioned it in another place, and so if so, I apologize for mentioning it here. I was recently talking with a client on the level of evidence that we need to design a study to get. And that's part of this being thoughtful thing, is again, planning ahead of time. What was happening there is the client wanted to put together a study with a single school to convince the world that their new program is working well. And we kind of pointed out this thought experiment. And I think this is good for you to think through as you're considering level of evidence of data of a potential experiment too, or a potential data collection. If this goes against everything that you think, would you believe it? If this drastically disagreed with you, would you believe it? And if the answer is no, why would you expect people who disagree with you to believe it if it goes against them? Ultimately, the level of evidence that you need with your pre-thought out, clearly expressed, planned study, it has to be a good enough study such that if the results went against you, you would believe the results. And if it's not that good, then it's not going to convince people who disagree with you. If it's not that good, if it wouldn't convince you if it said something you didn't want it to say, it's not going to convince somebody else if it says something they don't want it to say. So think through, again, the quality of the evidence you're putting together and be thoughtful about that. Be thoughtful about that. So one other thing regarding being thoughtful is being aware of the broader context of the question. And that is, sometimes we make decisions that may need a great deal of confidence in them, and other times we don't. I took psychometrics. It's a study of putting together measurement instruments. One of my graduate professors in this worked in education. And he used to say, look, if I'm determining for students, who gets in line first, and I'm writing a test to just say, okay, you get to be first in line today, I don't necessarily care how accurate it is, because it's not that big of a deal in the grand schemes. On the other hand, if I'm writing a test and the results of this test are going to determine if you get put in advanced placement classes or not, and ultimately how successful you're going to be in college and later on, I need to be much, much, much more accurate, much, much more confident in my conclusions. So if you're implementing something or studying some data and trying to make a decision, where the results really don't matter. You can continue monitoring, you can see how it works. I mean, there are some cases where you may not even need to collect data. It's just such a trivial issue that, hey, let's try something new. It's not a big deal if it fails or not. And we'll just see how it goes. Like it's not needed to get that level of evidence. On the other hand, when you're making decisions that could affect lives, and in medicine, we do this. We make decisions regarding care that can affect lives. We make decisions regarding billing that can affect people's lives. We make decisions regarding our procedures that can affect potentially thousands and thousands of man hours, both across staff and across patient time. When we do those things, we need to have lots of confidence in that. We need to make sure that we are implementing this with a series of confidence that supports the weight of the decision. And that's important to consider too, is that the level of evidence that we talk about in our statistical storytelling, again, sometimes this can be very minimal if the stakes are very low and if there's easy opportunity for change. But sometimes the decisions that we consider might be extraordinarily costly, perhaps costly to implement, perhaps costly if we get the answer wrong. And in those cases, we want to make sure that we are including more and more evidence. This is part of the be thoughtful recommendation in that you have to consider the context in which you're making decisions when you're putting together your story regarding the evidence. So it's important to be thoughtful and think, I don't want to say outside the box because I'm not asking you to think about anything new or come at it from a different creative, edgy angle. That's kind of the opposite of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, don't get so caught up in trying to interpret the statistical analysis that you forget the broader context in which this is helping. Statistical analyses are guesses, nothing more. We're trying to make an educated, well-informed guess, but it's still a guess. Ultimately, it's the situation and that situation's outcome that we're trying to have an impact on. And that is the case that you need, one of the cases that you need to be thoughtful about. Be open. It is really important to be transparent about the entire process when you're doing statistical storytelling. I think I mentioned earlier that my rule of thumb, and it actually is my rule of thumb, is you can report anything and you can do anything as long as you tell everybody what you did. And I think that works well because it's good to think about, am I comfortable being open about this? If I ignore evidence from 95% of my variables, am I comfortable telling everybody clearly, openly, transparent, not hiding it deep in a report, but am I comfortable with everybody truly knowing about this? And that's kind of the thing behind being open, is not just, trying to get away with something. And I'm assuming you're not. Again, statistical storytelling, we're not trying to get away with anything. We're trying to understand the data to the best of our analytics ability, and tell the story of the data to the best of our analytics ability. So we're approaching this from the perspective that that's not your goal. And within this, it's still important to be transparent. And a good way to think about this is, again, not I included it deep in the report, but that my entire audience knows about each of this and understands about each thing that happened. That's what being open is about, is to try to make sure that everyone in the audience knows and understands this. And this is important because not everybody in the audience is familiar with statistics. Not everybody understands what's going on and what are the components. We'll talk about that more in a second, but thinking about this, like in terms of when, how your tests were planned, we talked earlier about a priori and post hoc. If you're doing it post hoc, why? How many other tests were considered? Again, did you pull results from 5 and ignore results from 95? Well, that should be clearly articulated. And again, not deep in a report. Everyone should know about that. and should support that decision. That's part of the statistical storytelling and presenting convincing evidence, is that we should be completely open about what happened and how we got there, so that everyone can agree when we come to the conclusion, and kind of nod their heads and say, oh yeah, well that's what this says, and we agree. So with regards to this, again, we earlier talked about a priori and post hoc, in terms of how the tests were run and considered, but you have to make sure your audience understands this, that they understand what's going on. Other things to be open about: data cleaning decisions, sample inclusion criterion, and more. So I actually keep a research journal when I'm working on cleaning a data set. And every time I make a decision, oh yeah, well that value is clearly, a typo or something like that, I record each and every one of those decisions and then have a team review those decisions to make sure those are the correct decisions. And sometimes they're not, and I can lean on that. The reason I can lean on it is because I have a review process built in. The reason I have the review process built in is to make sure that, again, when I present this, when I tell the statistical story, everyone can be on the same page regarding this. And if I speak to a few people and we're all on the same page as to, oh yeah, that was the right decision, of course you remove someone with a height of 870 feet tall. Maybe that was a typo. Or a height of 60 feet tall. Maybe they were trying to write 60 inches. Of course you would remove that or edit that. Then in those cases, I can feel more confident presenting that statistical story, and again, being open regarding this. And when being open, ideally being convincing that everyone agrees, oh yes, this is the way we go. But I have to say it. I have to have that full disclosure. And again, it has to not be buried deep in a report in the tiny print. It has to be something that anyone could reasonably look at and understand. In fact, in my reports, these types of decisions are typically one of the first things we talk about in the report, so that everyone can contextualize the rest of the information within the edits made to the data. I kind of talked about this earlier, but because we're often reporting to practitioner audiences, at least the students within this class will be, rather than say methodologists or statisticians, you need to explain how the design decisions impact the story. So we talked earlier about when and how the analyses were planned. We just talked about data cleaning decisions. All of these things have an impact on the level of evidence regarding the story. And all of these things are things to make sure that you're articulating. Again, be open isn't have it written somewhere in the fine print. Be open is make sure everybody really understands this and that we can have conversations. There should be challenges and limitations to your study. There always are, and that's okay. It's important to acknowledge those, not just for the sake of writing it on paper, but for the sake of determining how reasonably could these impact the decisions. And hopefully the answer is not very much. But if the answer is very much, then everybody should know about it so that we can make the decision in light of that information. Now, one interesting thing here too ties with the uncertainty that we talked about previously. Accept uncertainty. Are our clients and constituents and team members happy that a study leaves room for uncertainty? No, never ever. But it's required to be open that we communicate that. To actually be open, we have to not just appear to be open, that we communicate, hey, studies involve uncertainty. It's statistics. We can always do 100% confidence interval. It's negative infinity to positive infinity, but that's not very useful. So we accept some uncertainty to gain a lot of usability. But it's important to, again, be clear and be open regarding what all the pieces are, and to make sure that you're targeting the core meaning of what this is addressing. Be modest. Again, there's no such thing as a perfect study. You can either acknowledge your imperfections or you can't. And I'll say again, just like with the be open, this is very much about the spirit of the principle more than the letter of the law. Writing a limitation section doesn't mean you're being modest. In fact, one of my personal pet peeves is people who write limitation sections in a very dishonest way. And this happens a lot more often than you may think. Studies will not list very serious, very concerning limitations regarding sample size, regarding instrumentation or analysis, regarding the fact that they're implementing exploratory research, that they tested 100 variables and only 5 were significant. And they're making large, grandiose claims based on these 5 and ignoring the other 95. And studies just don't mention that. They might have some pro forma limitation section on, well, we didn't have data on the whole population, so we can't be 100% sure. It's like, no. You had serious problems here that you're not even acknowledging. Yeah, you can hear. I get irritated about this. So when we are being modest in a statistical storytelling context, it's just admitting the results are what they are and they aren't what they aren't, and they don't have to be everything. A small study shouldn't change the world, and this is sometimes hard to acknowledge. But I talk about this often when I'm working with university professors who are studying undergraduates and say, "Look, you've studied undergraduates from a single school. This result shouldn't shake the world. Like it's cool that your program works." But now we have to go try it with other schools. Now we have to go try it with other professors teaching the program. Let's see if it's the program or if it's you as the professor. Now we got to go try this more. So small studies shouldn't change global practice. But it should be evidence to start a bigger study and then a bigger one. And, once we have a big study or two, once we have a series of small studies demonstrating effectiveness across a variety of different situations, that's when we start having the amount of evidence to see change. And again, this goes back to something we also talked earlier about, which is that for large or costly changes, you should have extraordinarily strong evidence. You should be extremely confident in the decision. And a small study is just not representative. Now, one of the reasons this isn't representative has actually been a caveat we have used in this course. We've talked about who inferential statistics apply to, and we said they apply to the population represented by the sample. So in that university example, if the sample is undergrads from a single university, the population represented by that sample isn't the whole world. It might be undergrads from that university. It might even be future undergrads from that university, assuming nothing significantly changes about the population served by the university. Like that is very limited in scope. And often small studies, again, it's not that the study was done poorly. It's not that statistics don't work with small studies. This tends to be the reason why it shouldn't change the world. It's that the sample within a small study is typically not representative of the whole world. So the small study results shouldn't apply to the whole world. We should go and collect samples with other different representative groups to make sure that this actually does work with everybody. And if it ends up working with everybody, then we should use it with everybody. But that's the order that we go in. We go with a small study. We determine if it works within our often the ideal case. I'm doing the thing within my hospital, and this is where I have seen this be effective previously, so this is the best chance of success of that. And then after that, then I don't just say, hey, everybody, you need to switch to my practice. Now what I do is I start to try this in different settings with different attending physicians, with different support staff and under different medical protocols. And I see, and with different patient types. And under this, I see, does this still work? And if the answer is yes, that's when we're going to start to have a practice that's going to change the world. But again, be modest regarding what your conclusions are. And again, this is that balance. This is that cognitive dissonance. You need to accept uncertainty. You need to be modest. And it's a balance. As part of this, clearly note the limitations and make supported conclusions. So your conclusions should be supported within the limitations. If there's this big thing, hey, we did this procedure and it worked, but everybody who had an ISS score greater than 15, this didn't work with, and everybody who had an ISS score less than 15, this did work with. Like that might be a limitation. And your conclusions shouldn't be this works. Your conclusions should be written within the context limitation. The story as told by that data, that I just cited and completely made up on the spot, is that story is not, this is an effective method across everywhere for everybody. That story is, well, within this sample, this is where it seemed to work and where it didn't. And depending on the strength of the study, we might have strong confidence that this is where it worked and where it didn't. And then we can move forward with that information. But it acknowledges not just what we found. It really doesn't lean, here's what we wanted to find. It focuses on, here's what we found within the context. And here's what we can walk away with feeling confident with supported conclusions supported from the data. So I wanted to pull a quote from this paper, and I really liked it because it seemed to summarize a lot of this. It says, the nexus of openness and modesty, remember 2 of our components, is to report everything while at the same time not concluding anything from a single study without unwarranted certainty. So that's a bit of our cognitive dissonance in terms of a reporting side, is that we want to be open, but we also want to make sure our conclusions are matching humbly what's going on. Because of this strong desire to inform and be informed, this is by our audience, there is a relentless demand for us to state results with certainty. Everybody wants us to be 100% positive about what we're saying. Everybody wants our recommendations to be, this is the recommendation, or this is what we need to do. And unfortunately, that's just not the way that statistics works. We never prove something. I can't tell you for certain. I can just say suggestively. Actually, this recently happened with a different client where I was working with them. We're working on a study design. They said, okay, well, what do we need to do to make sure this works? And I said, look, we can do things to increase the chance that this works, or to increase the chance that we find this result if the program is working. But we can't just make sure that it's going to work. This is all a measure of probability. And again, this will all come back to the fact that this is a measure of probability because I can't measure everybody. I can't measure entire populations. And if you ever think you can, remember, a lot of times we want our current results to affect future people. So you never can. You can never measure future people. And because of that, our results are always said with a bit of modesty. Our results are always said accepting uncertainty that is inherent within statistics. And I really like this end sentence. It says, accept uncertainty and embrace it, because it's always there, whether you want it to be or not. You can either accept it or you can't. And the citation for this paper is below. But I think this is really, really helpful in terms of understanding and comprehensively getting how we put this together. All right, this has gotten very long. I'm actually going to keep going. I apologize, but definitely pause and take a break too. We've got 2 more slides, and then we'll be done with this little subsection. And I do apologize for the length, but I hope you're seeing the value of this and where this is coming from and how important this can be. Again, not just ethically when it comes to statistical storytelling, but in terms of the evidence that we have. It's a weird case in which if you try to cheat the system, your evidence literally, mathematically literally, becomes worse. And actually, the more you try to cheat, the more your evidence is unmathematically supported. It's kind of a weird thing. It's like if I ever went to court and I tried to bring like a falsified piece of evidence. I've got the bloody knife, and I falsified it in some way. Like I handed it to the judge, and it just dissolved in my hand as I handed it to the judge. That's kind of what it is in statistics. As we fabricate things, the evidence that provides is no longer evidence. There's no shortcuts. And anytime we do take a shortcut, that evidence is now, it dissolves in your hand. It's now no longer evidence. It's kind of an interesting thing. All right. So what we talked about before, and I've hit this pretty hard, is that we're not supposed to come to the data with any presuppositions. Now, I want to back off to that just a titch, just a thimbleful, just a millimeter, and say, in reality, there's something that drove us to look into these questions in the first place. So something told us that we're approaching this, like to even ask the question. And so it's important to not make that a presupposition that you tie to. But it's important to acknowledge that I came into this for a reason. Maybe I saw somebody who tried to practice and it seemed to be effective. Or maybe I read a new theory and it hasn't been applied, but now that I think about it, we could apply it in this way. Or maybe I saw this happen at a different hospital, and that's not what we do here, but I think their approach might be effective here. So I have these presuppositions. I think the new medical practice is going to work. I think the new hospital policy is going to work. And that's why I'm studying this in the first place. And this slide is on how we approach that. And ultimately, we just have to keep an open mind on the issue. Now, what's interesting is sometimes if we do this, I might think that new practice is going to work, but the data disagree. What do we do then? This is also, and I'm probably overusing or misusing this word. I apologize, especially if any of you I don't know, grew up with it. I didn't grow up with the term cognitive dissonance, but I'm going to use it again anyway. This is another cognitive dissonance thing, but it's really, it's just that there's two balancing factors, and I want to encourage both heavily. I really want to encourage you to do both because I've seen mistakes made in both directions. So if I'm approaching a story, I think this is going to work, but hey, Dr. Florin told me I need to keep an open mind, so I'm going to keep an open mind, and lo and behold, the data disagreed. The data really don't show this is an effective practice. What do I do? Well, I'm going to encourage you to do two things. I'm going to encourage you to investigate more, and I'm going to encourage you to keep that learner mindset at the same time. Investigate more. Figure out why this is different than what you thought. And I can't encourage this enough because I have seen individuals and researchers that blindly follow the data. They start out, I see this effective practice, and so I want to study this and see if it'll be effective in my institution. And I get results that are in the opposite direction. And many well-meaning but ultimately misguided individuals get results that are quite bizarre and go against everything they've ever known. And then believe that because, quote, that's what the data says. But consider, what if there's a typo? What if the question on the survey was misphrased? What if the data were collected poorly, or the sample was not particularly representative of the population that you're trying to study? Or what if the analyses were misinterpreted or a variable was miscoded? I was recently hired, actually, by a public health company to investigate analysis that was done on them. And this analysis previously showed that their program was statistically significantly harmful. And there was a piece of feedback that just pointed out, hey, we can't use this program. It's significantly harmful. And so I was hired to come in and go look at this. And ultimately I did. And the source of this, the culprit, why was this the case? Well, data said so. So I guess we got to just close up shop, right? Well, no. What ended up happening was that the treatment and control groups were coded the opposite way. That when they were put in the analysis, the treatment, everybody who was in the control was labeled as treatment, and everybody in the treatment was labeled as control. And it turned out the treatment had a statistically significant positive effect, but because it was mislabeled, everybody was under the impression that it had a negative effect. This goes to something I said earlier in this video too, which is it doesn't really matter the reason why, how silly or stupid or easy to fix. The reason is that we make a bad decision. Any of those things still lead us to make a bad decision. They are all equally fatal flaws. So again, in this particular case, this company had to deal with that finding for years because of this fatal flaw. And again, very simple fix, very easy fix. Once you observed it, it was very clear. This wasn't like maybe this is the case. This was extremely clear. Oh my goodness. And it was, I shouldn't say more complicated. It wasn't really more complicated than that. But on looking back, we saw, oh my goodness, all of these participants have been mislabeled. And more accurately, the analysis was misinterpreted based on the opposite labels. All this is to say, this stuff happens. This stuff happens. Did it take a long time to find? Yes. But could the company, the results didn't go the way the company wanted. Could they ignore those results because it wasn't the way they wanted? Absolutely not. No, you can't. How do you solve this? You keep digging until you figure out what is going on. You just got to keep going. Other things that I've seen, outcomes are being analyzed that are unrelated. So like we studied a variable that wasn't at all related to what the program was actually having an impact on. Maybe the program was having an impact on medical effects, and we studied financial outcomes. And ultimately, it wasn't having an effect on financial outcomes. Or maybe we studied financial outcomes, and or the program was meant to affect financial outcomes, and we studied medical effects. And the medical effects were neutral, but the financial outcomes were much better. And so by studying the wrong variable, we believe the program's not effective simply because we're not actually studying what the program was intended to target. I've actually seen that several. There's one very specific case I am recalling where this was the case, that it turned out that the main outcome that data was being collected on was not something the program was actually intending to target. And so it made the program look like it was ineffective. The program actually was doing a great job. We just weren't measuring what it was changing and what it was intended to change. They were just measuring this one variable because they thought that's what they had to measure. Poorly phrased survey items I've seen have an impact here. Other situations I've seen, poorly designed or underpowered studies. We don't have the sample size to really find. In any case, all of this is to say, if you are approaching a situation and think, hey, I think this is going to be effective, let's put together a study. Hey, Dr. Florin told me to not hold to these presuppositions, let the data guide me, and the data disagree with what you expect. Dig into it. Make sure that that's really what's going on. Make sure it's not a typo. Make sure it's not an error. Make sure it's not misunderstood or misphrased. Make sure that that's what's going on. Frankly, you should do this even when the data agree with you. You need to be 100% sure that you are confident in the data quality and the analytic interpretation. But it is very important when things are not going as you expect. In my experience, often those presuppositions are there for a reason. And that's why I have this as a huge bullet point. And that's why I'm taking 5 minutes to talk about this in a lecture slide on statistical storytelling, is because I've worked with clients a lot who, when data go against their presuppositions, they try to be good data stewards and just abandon their presuppositions. They've watched this program work for years and then say, oh, well, the program must not work because data said so, and never dug deeper. Now, let me be clear. The thing that's most common when the data disagree with you is that you were wrong and the data are right. But that's not inevitable. That's not a 100% thing. Now, I guess in a way that is a 100% thing, but it's not always related in the way that you think it's related. So when I say investigate more, figure out what's going on. And, ultimately, if everything looks right, if it looks like all the data were collected well, if it looks like the sample's representative, if it looks like the analysis is being interpreted appropriately, if it looks like all the data was entered correctly and the variables are coded correctly for the analysis, if all those things look right, then you have to keep that learner mindset. You have to be prepared to be convinced that you're wrong by the data, and that's okay. Now, if you can't do this, if you can't keep that learner mindset, if when things don't go the way you expect, you believe, oh, it has to be the data that's wrong, not you. Again, having done your due diligence, and please do, not just a guilty admission, please, I encourage you, I implore you to take the time to investigate your data and make sure everything's correct. But if after doing that, you still are like, well, it still must be the data that are wrong, consider what the purpose is in even doing statistics. If you already know the answer ahead of time, um, then maybe statistics wasn't the right path for what you're looking to do. Maybe you're not using statistics with the learner mindset. Maybe you're not approaching the statistical storytelling with the goal of figuring out what the data say. Again, in the cases where we have reason to believe ahead of time, these presuppositions, loosely held presuppositions on what's going to happen and it disagrees, use that as an opportunity to give you energy to investigate the situation more closely. Figure out what's going on. And often there's a reason for why that disagrees, and that becomes part of your story. Oh, the question was phrased like this, so that's what's going on there. Maybe we still need to do a different study with the question rephrased. And these things happen all the time. Not 100% of the time, but they happen. They absolutely happen. I had to put a percentage on it. I'll say 30 or 40% of the time. When you think something's going to happen, actually it might even be more than that. Let's say 50 or 60% of the time. When you think something's going to happen and the data disagree, that when you investigate, you might see why. And if it's the data are moving in the right direction, but it's not statistically significant, that's often a sample size issue. And we'll discuss that later on here too, but that can be the case as well. On the other hand, there's another 50% of the time where your presupposition was just wrong. Maybe that approach worked at the other hospital, but it doesn't work with your patients. Maybe that medical procedure worked really well with that one patient, but doesn't work on average with the patients in the broader population or in the broader sample that's being used to represent your group. So in those cases, that's where you can learn. And that doesn't invalidate your previous experiences. That doesn't mean that the program didn't work at that other hospital. That doesn't mean that the medical procedure wasn't effective for that one participant. What that means is that maybe those things are not true, broadly speaking. And that's where you can learn from your data. And again, keep that learner's mindset. And when you're writing the statistical story, again, tell that statistical story. And I encourage you, all of this becomes part of the story. When you investigate more, that becomes part of the story. Team, y'all, when you're working on this, hey, I saw this result. I didn't understand it. I had to dive into it. Absolutely. Tell that as part of your story. This is what I did. This is where I went. This is where I went. I just couldn't figure out why. This is where I went. This is where I went. And when you find an answer, tell how you found the answer and tell what you think it means or how it could be applicable. And that's what we're going to dive into in the next video. And if you can't find the answer, then tell all of that to say, look, I checked all of these things. I triple checked, and it still worked out this way. This is just where our numbers fell. So it looks like, this program might be relatively neutral, or maybe it's trending in the right direction, but the sample size wasn't large enough to determine that. And a confidence interval could help you figure out what's the reasonable range of effects that you could expect if you did this study again. So keep that learner's mindset if you end up, after investigating, not finding what you're looking for. So this has been a discussion of kind of the tone to take when telling statistical stories. Really big picture thoughts and ideas, a lot of conversation regarding how to approach this, what to aim for, what to lean away from, a lot about your mindset in approaching this. And again, this is a very, very important thing. The American Statistical Association in many ways has a special issue of their journal out about just doing this and just doing this well, published just a few years ago. So this is extraordinarily important, and I hope you found this helpful. Now, this might not have been what you were expecting, so in the future videos, we are going to dive more into specifics, onto the specific types of evidence that we can present and the contributions that each of that make, and ultimately how we can use those in tandem.